June 6, 1944, somewhere in Normandy. Private Tom Wilson's fingers trembled as he worked his knife around the rim of the K-ration tin. The metal edge bit into his cracked skin, mingling his blood with the congealed grease oozing from the can. Around him, the stench of wet wool uniforms and cordite mixed with something worse, the unmistakable aroma of industrial food preservation. Jesus H. Christ, muttered Corporal Harris, watching the gelatinous mass quiver in Wilson's hands. That thing looks back at you. Wilson exhaled sharply through his nose. Says here it's ham and eggs. Looks more like something my dog threw up after eating a boot. A chorus of weary laughter rippled through the foxhole. Private Jenkins, barely 19 with a face still soft from high school, reached for his own tin. The metallic screech of the pull tab echoed like a dying animal. Breakfast of champions, Harris said, lighting a cigarette with hands that hadn't been clean in weeks. The match's flare illuminated the dark circles under his eyes. 3 squares a day, courtesy of Uncle Sam's finest food scientists. Wilson forced a mouthful past his lips. The texture was all wrong. Too smooth, too uniform, like chewing on a rubber eraser soaked in lard. The taste hit him a second later. Salt. So much salt it burned, followed by something chemical that lingered at the back of his throat. Tastes like. Wilson gagged, searching for words. Defeat, Harris offered, exhaling smoke through his nose. Like someone boiled a typewriter ribbon, Wilson decided, forcing down another bite. His stomach growled in protest, but the gnawing hunger won out over revulsion. Jenkins made a strangled noise. Mine's moving. Harris leaned over. That's the cheese spread, kid. Or what the army calls cheese. Could be grease. Could be paint. Hell, could be both. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of the latrine trench across their position. Wilson found himself grateful for it. Anything to overpower the smell of the so-called food in his hands. He stared at the tiny packet of instant coffee, the 4 cigarettes, the single square of toilet paper that passed for a meal. Remember that diner back in Jersey? Jenkins asked suddenly, his voice too loud in the pre-dawn quiet. The one with the blue checkered curtains? They're pancakes. Shut up about pancakes, Harris snapped, but there was no real anger in it. Just exhaustion. Just hunger that went deeper than any K-ration could fill. Wilson turned the tin in his hands, reading the stamped lettering in the faint light. Property of U.S. Army. Not for resale. He almost laughed. As if anyone in their right mind would buy this. As if this was something you could sell instead of something you endured. Somewhere to the east, artillery rumbled like a hungry stomach. Wilson took another bite, chewing mechanically, swallowing past the lump in his throat that had nothing to do with the food. Breakfast was served. The war went on. The cigarette burned down to Wilson's fingers before he noticed the pain. He flicked the stub into the mud, watching it hiss and die. Around him, the company stirred to life. The metallic clink of canteens, the wet smack of boots pulling free from the sucking earth, the low curses of men who hadn't slept. Mail call, Harris announced, tossing a bundle of letters into Wilson's lap. Your sweetheart forget you already. Wilson ignored him, tearing open the top envelope with teeth still gritty from the morning's coffee substitute. The paper smelled of home, faintly of lavender soap and the cedar chest his mother kept her stationery in. The words blurred as he read. Dearest Tommy, the Victory Garden's coming in nicely. We canned 40 jars of green beans yesterday. Mrs. Peterson says we should be getting sugar rations soon. A shell whistled overhead. Wilson didn't flinch. The explosion rattled his teeth half a click east. The Red Cross says we can send 1 care package per month. I'm putting in those peppermints you like. Wilson, Sergeant Barkley's voice cut through the letter. You and Harris, Recon Patrol. Move out in 5. Harris groaned, slapping his helmet onto his head. Another stroll through paradise. He caught Wilson staring at the letter. What's the matter? She run off with some 4F bastard working the shipyards. Wilson folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket where it would soak up his sweat and heartbeat. She's sending candy. Harris froze mid-step. Real candy? Not that Hershey's cement they issue. Peppermints. The kind from. Wilson's throat closed. The drugstore on Main Street with the soda fountain. The way the winter sunlight came through the window at 3 p.m. and made the glass jars glow. The memory was so vivid it hurt. Harris's face did something complicated. Well, fuck me sideways. He kicked at a mud clod. Guess we better not get shot today, huh? The patrol moved out single file through the mist. Wilson's boots made wet sucking sounds in the clay. Somewhere to the west, a machine gun stuttered like a broken sewing machine. The smell of last night's K-ration beef stew still clung to his uniform, a greasy, metallic stench that no amount of rain could wash out. Jenkins brought up the rear, his rifle barrel catching the first week's sunlight. "You think the Germans eat this bad?" he whispered. Harris snorted. "Heard from the Brits they got real bread. Actual goddamn bread." Wilson's stomach growled. The image of his mother's kitchen, the yeasty smell of rising dough, the way she'd hum "Don't sit under the apple tree" while kneading, hit him like a bullet to the gut. A twig snapped ahead. The patrol froze. Wilson's mouth went dry as the K-ration crackers. His fingers found the trigger guard automatically. A French hare bolted across their path. The tension bled out of Wilson's shoulders. "Breakfast," Harris muttered wistfully, watching it disappear into the brush. "If we were goddamn Indians, we'd eat like kings." The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the war waited. Wilson adjusted his pack straps, feeling the weight of his rations. 3 more tins of ham and lima beans. That tasted like despair. He touched the letter in his pocket again. The peppermints would never make it here. He knew that, but for a moment, he could almost taste the cool sweetness on his tongue, cutting through the ever-present flavor of gunpowder and mud and industrialized food. The patrol moved on. Somewhere ahead, a bird sang. It sounded like home. The patrol reached the bombed-out farmhouse just as the sun burned through the clouds. Wilson's boots crunched on broken china as he stepped through what had once been someone's kitchen. A cast-iron stove lay appended in the corner, its pipe dangling like a broken neck. "Check for supplies," Barkley ordered, kicking aside a chair with no legs. "But leave the silverware. We ain't thieves." Harris snorted, prying open a warped cupboard. "Just killers passing through." His voice echoed strangely in the empty house. Wilson's foot struck something soft. A child's doll, its porcelain face cracked clean down the middle. One glass, I stared up at him accusingly. He nudged it under the rubble with his toe. "Jackpot," Harris called from the pantry. He held up a dusty jar of preserves, the fruit inside long since turned to syrup. The Krauts missed this. The men gathered around like wolves. Barkley unsheathed his bayonet and pried off the lid. The smell hit Wilson first. Real sugar, real fruit, not the canned corn syrup taste of K-ration jam. His mouth watered painfully. "1 spoon each," Barkley said, producing a mess kit spoon from his pack. "And Wilson gets first dibs. Birthday boy's privilege." Wilson blinked. "It's not my." "Shut up and eat, soldier." The spoon trembled in his hand. The preserves were clotted with age, the color of old blood. He hesitated just a second before shoving it in his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue. Real strawberries, summer sunshine trapped in glass. For one dizzying moment, he was 10 years old again, stealing berries from his neighbor's patch, the juice running down his chin while his mother scolded him from the porch. "Christ," Harris groaned, watching Wilson's face. "That good?" Wilson couldn't speak. He handed the spoon over, his eyes stinging. The men passed the jar in reverent silence, each savoring their mouthful like communion wine. Jenkins licked the spoon clean. "Better than that Compete shit they give us." The distant crump of artillery shook dust from the ceiling. Barkley checked his watch. "Move out. We're behind schedule." Wilson lingered as the others filed out. He stared at the empty jar, its lid bent beyond repair. Some French housewife had put this up years ago, never imagining it would end up in the hands of filthy American boys. He thought of his mother's pantry back home, the neat rows of preserves glowing like jewels in the cellar light. "Wilson," Barkley barked from outside. He set the jar carefully on the broken counter. It looked absurd there amid the ruins, this one intact thing. The doll single, I seemed to watch him as he left. Outside, the men were already 20 yards ahead, their silhouettes blurred by the rising morning haze. Wilson adjusted his rifle strap, and broke into a jog to catch up. The taste of strawberries lingered on his tongue, sweet and sad, and already fading. The sun hung fat and white in the sky when they found the German ration dump. A shallow crater half filled with rainwater, floating packets of something dark and rectangular bobbed like miniature rafts. Harris was first to the edge, his rifle slung across his back. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. "Looks like Santa came early." Wilson's boots slid in the mud as he approached. The water was tinged pink, whether from rust or something else he didn't want to know. Dozens of waxed paper packages floated just out of reach. Chocolate. Jenkins read slowly off one packet, his tongue stumbling over the foreign word. "That means chocolate, right?" Barkley scanned the tree line before nodding. 5 minutes. And for God's sake, don't drink the water. Harris was already fishing out packets with his bayonet. The first one he opened contained a dense brown brick that smelled faintly of cocoa and motor oil. He broke off a chunk with his teeth and immediately spat. "Tastes like Hitler's asshole." Wilson waded in up to his knees, the icy water seeping through his leggings. The packet he retrieved was slightly bloated, the wax paper peeling at the edges. Inside, the chocolate had bloomed white with age but still carried that unmistakable sweet scent beneath the damp. He took a cautious bite. The texture was gritty, the flavor overwhelmingly bitter with an aftertaste of something earthy, like coffee grounds mixed with wet newspaper. But it was chocolate. Real chocolate. Not the chalky ration bricks that could double as tank armor. "Gimme that," Harris said, snatching the bar. He chewed thoughtfully. Could use some sugar, but hell, better than K-ration gum. Jenkins had collected an armful of packets, his grin making him look 12 years old. "We're gonna eat like kings tonight." Barkley checked his watch again. 2 minutes. "And we're taking half that back for the platoon." Wilson's fingers worked automatically, stuffing his pockets with the least damaged packages. The chocolate was already melting against his thigh, leaving dark stains on his fatigues. He thought of the letter in his breast pocket, the promised peppermints that would never come. Maybe this was better, this unexpected gift from the enemy, fished from blood-tinged water. A sudden rustle in the hedgerow froze them all. Wilson's hand went to his rifle before he saw it was just a crow, its beady eyes assessing their find. The bird cocked its head, as if judging their scavenging. "Beat it, buzzard," Harris muttered, throwing a rock. The crow lifted off with an indignant caw. Barkley shouldered his weapon. "Time's up. Move out." As they trudged back toward their lines, Wilson slipped another piece of chocolate into his mouth. The bitterness made his jaw clench, but he held it on his tongue until it dissolved completely. It tasted like stolen moments, like small victories in a war that gave none freely. Harris nudged him with an elbow. "Save some for the rest of us, birthday boy." Wilson smiled around the last sweet traces. For the first time in weeks, his stomach didn't ache with hunger. The chocolate sat heavy and warm inside him, a quiet rebellion against the rations and the rules and the relentless machinery of war. June 7th, 1944, 1,630 hours. The smell of brewing coffee greeted them as they returned to camp. Real coffee, not the burnt chicory substitute they'd been drinking since England. Wilson's nose twitched at the rich aroma as they approached the makeshift mess area. "Don't get excited," Harris muttered. "Probably just for officers." But to their surprise, a grinning cook stood stirring an enormous pot over a fire pit. "Liberated goods, boys," he announced, courtesy of the Luftwaffe's abandoned supply drop. Jenkins nearly dropped his armful of chocolate. "You mean we get real food?" The cook winked. "Real enough to kill you slower than kraut bullets." The line moved quickly. Wilson accepted his tin cup of coffee, the steam curling up to caress his stubbled face. The first sip burned his tongue, but he didn't care. It tasted like smoke and earth and something almost forgotten called civilization. Harris sniffed his cup suspiciously. "This ain't the usual gutter water." "Brazilian beans," the cook said proudly. "Jerry must have stolen it from some fancy Paris cafe." Wilson closed his eyes as he drank, letting the warmth spread through his chest. For a moment, he wasn't in Normandy. He was back in that Jersey diner, the one with the blue checkered curtains, sitting at the counter while the waitress refilled his cup for a nickel. The fantasy shattered when artillery rumbled in the distance. Wilson's eyes snapped open to see Barkley approaching with 2 Red Cross workers in tow. "Mail's here," Barkley announced. Then, seeing their cups, "Where the hell did you get real coffee?" The cook grinned. "War's full of surprises, Sarge." Wilson set down his cup as the Red Cross worker handed him a small package. The brown paper wrapping was damp at the edges, the string loose from handling. His fingers trembled as he peeled it back. Inside lay 3 things: a tin of peppermints, a photograph of his mother standing by their victory garden, and a single, perfect strawberry preserved in wax paper. Harris whistled. "Would you look at that? The Army Postal Service actually delivered something." Wilson couldn't speak. He lifted the strawberry carefully, its red surface still gleaming as if freshly picked. The scent, sweet and bright, cut through the camp's odors of sweat and gunpowder. Jenkins peered over his shoulder. "That ain't gonna last long in this heat." Wilson nodded, swallowing hard. He knew what he had to do. Breaking the berry in half, he offered part to Harris. His friend's eyes widened. "Hell no, that's yours." "Happy birthday to me," Wilson said, forcing a smile. The strawberry juice stained his fingers pink as he divided it further, passing pieces to Jenkins and Barkley. The taste exploded on his tongue, summer condensed into a single bite. For that moment, the war ceased to exist. There was only this, the sweetness, the shared silence between soldiers, and the unspoken understanding that some gifts were too precious to keep to oneself. The strawberry was gone too soon. Wilson licked his fingers clean, then carefully folded the wax paper back into his pocket. The photograph joined his mother's letter, while the tin of peppermints went unopened, a promise to save her later. Harris clapped him on the shoulder. "Best damn birthday present ever, huh?" Wilson looked around at the muddy camp, the exhausted men, the ever-present smell of war. He touched the photo in his pocket. Yeah, he lied. The best. June 7th, 1944, 2,100 hours. The camp settled into an uneasy quiet as night fell. The sporadic crack of distant rifle fire echoed through the hedgerows, but no one paid it much mind anymore. Wilson sat on his bedroll, the tin of peppermints resting in his palm, unopened. He traced the edges with his thumb, feeling the slight dent where it had been jostled during its long journey across the Atlantic. Harris flopped down beside him, stretching out with a groan. "You gonna stare at that all night, or actually eat one?" Wilson shook his head. "Saving them." "For what?" "The second coming." Harris snorted, but there was no real bite to it. He pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes and lit one, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the exhaustion on his face. Wilson didn't answer. He couldn't explain, not in a way Harris would understand. That opening the tin meant admitting this was as good as it got. That the war wasn't ending tomorrow. That home wasn't just a train ride away. Jenkins joined them, cradling a canteen cup filled with something that smelled suspiciously like stolen officer's whiskey. "To Wilson's, Ma," he announced, raising the cup before taking a swig. He grimaced and passed it to Harris. "Best damn strawberry I ever had." Harris drank and coughed. "Jesus, kid, what is this?" "Paint thinner. Better than that battery acid they call coffee." Jenkins shot back, grinning. Wilson finally pocketed the mints and accepted the canteen cup when it came his way. The liquor burned all the way down, but it was a clean burn, not like the stale aftertaste of K-rations or the metallic tang of fear that never really left his mouth these days. Somewhere in the dark, a harmonica started up, a slow, mournful tune Wilson didn't recognize but felt in his bones anyway. The notes curled through the camp like smoke, blending with the scent of damp earth and gun oil. Harris exhaled, watching the cigarette smoke drift toward the stars. "You know what I miss most?" Wilson waited. Sunday dinners. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, gravy so thick you could stand a spoon in it. Harris's voice was quieter now, almost lost under the harmonica's lament. "My old man carving it up at the head of the table, my ma fussing over the peas." He trailed off, then shook his head. "Hell, never thought I'd miss peas." Jenkins chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. Wilson closed his eyes. He could see it. His own family's table, the way the light fell through the kitchen window in the late afternoon, the sound of his father's laugh. The memories were so sharp they hurt. The harmonica played on, and for a little while, in the dark, they let themselves remember. June 8, 1944, 0430 hours. The scream of incoming shells tore through the pre-dawn stillness. Wilson was on his feet before fully awake, the taste of copper flooding his mouth as his heart hammered against his ribs. Dirt rained down as the first explosion lit up the eastern tree line in an orange flash. Counterattack. Barclay's voice cut through the chaos. Move, move. Wilson grabbed his rifle, fingers finding the familiar grooves in the stock by muscle memory. The peppermint tin fell from his lap, disappearing into the mud as he sprinted for the foxhole. Harris was already there, slamming a fresh clip into his M1. "Happy fucking birthday," he growled as Wilson tumbled in beside him. The ground shook as another shell landed 30 yards to their left, showering them with clods of earth. Wilson wiped dirt from his eyes and peered over the rim. Shadows moved in the half-light, the distinctive silhouette of German helmets bobbing through the mist. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, fogging the cold morning air. A flare went up, casting everything in eerie white light. The advancing figures froze like actors on a stage. Wilson didn't think. He fired. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, once, twice. One of the shadows crumpled. Beside him, Harris worked methodically, his Garand's ping sounding every 8 rounds as the clip ejected. "They're pushing hard," he muttered between shots. "Must want their chocolate back." Wilson's fingers were numb around the trigger. He fired again. Missed. Adjusted. Fired. A scream answered from the field. Then the machine gun opened up from their right flank, tracers stitching red lines through the gray dawn. Wilson ducked as bullets chewed the dirt above their position. He could hear Jenkins yelling something, the words lost in the cacophony. "Grenade." Harris yanked him down just as the explosion sent hot shrapnel singing overhead. The concussion left Wilson's ears ringing, his vision blurred with tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his eyes. When he looked again, the Germans were falling back. The machine gun kept firing, covering their retreat. The sudden silence when it stopped was almost worse than the noise. Wilson realized he was shaking. His mouth tasted of gunpowder and bile. He reached automatically for his canteen, but it was empty. He drained it last night after the whiskey. Harris nudged him with an elbow. "You hit." Wilson shook his head. Then he saw it. A dark stain spreading across Harris's left sleeve. "You are." Harris glanced down as if noticing for the first time. "Huh, would you look at that?" He rolled up the sleeve to reveal a shallow gash. "Just a scratch. The war's not getting rid of me that easy." Wilson fumbled for his first aid kit, hands still unsteady. As he wrapped the wound, his fingers brushed against something in the mud, the peppermint tin, dented but intact. He wiped it clean on his shirt and handed it to Harris. "Happy birthday to me," Harris said, popping it open. He offered Wilson the first mint. The sharp sweetness cut through the taste of battle, clean and bright as a bell. Wilson closed his eyes, letting it dissolve on his tongue. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. The war wasn't over, but for this moment, they were alive. June 8th, 1944, 1,130 hours. The medic had stitched Harris up with all the tenderness of a butcher wrapping a cut of meat. "Keep it clean," he'd grunted before moving on to the next man, leaving Harris with a bandage already seeping red at the edges. Wilson watched his friend flex his fingers, testing the limits of the wound. "You should get proper medical." Harris scoffed. "And miss all the fun." He nodded toward the field kitchen, where a fresh batch of K-rations were being doled out. "Come on. Maybe today's mystery meat won't kill us." The line was long, the men shuffling forward with the resigned patience of cattle. Wilson's stomach growled, but the thought of another tin of greasy, processed slop made his jaw clench. He glanced down at the peppermint tin in his pocket, half empty now after sharing with Harris. The rest he was saving. For what? He still didn't know. Jenkins joined them, his face smeared with dirt and something darker. "Heard we're moving out soon," he said, keeping his voice low. "Push east toward some village with a name I can't pronounce." Harris groaned. "More walking." More fighting. More K-rations. He kicked at a rock. War is hell, boys. When they reached the front of the line, the cook, a new guy with a permanent scowl, slapped a tin into each of their hands without looking up. Next, Wilson turned the can over. Ham and lima beans stared back at him in bold black letters. The most hated of all K-rations. Even the Germans wouldn't take this off dead Americans. Jenkins made a sound of despair. I'd rather eat my boot. Harris was already prying his open with a bayonet. Could be worse, he said, though his expression said otherwise. Could be that cheese they gave us last week. Wilson forced himself to eat. The beans were mushy, the ham gristly and gray. It tasted like surrender. As he chewed, his fingers found the photograph in his pocket. His mother by the Victory Garden, smiling like the war was something that happened to other people. He wondered if she knew what ham and lima beans really looked like. If she knew how far Jersey felt when you were sitting in a foxhole, eating food that barely qualified as such. Harris nudged him. Mail's here again. Wilson looked up to see Barkley approaching with another bundle of letters. Fewer this time. The men gathered like starving dogs, hands outstretched. Wilson. Barkley tossed him a single envelope. From your girl. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Wilson tore it open, his pulse quickening. Inside was a letter from his sister. Tommy, Mom's been putting extra sugar in everything since you left. Says the soldiers need sweet things to keep their spirits up. Dad won't talk about the war, but he listens to the radio every night. We all do. The strawberries came in early this year. I saved some for you in the cellar, but they won't last. Hope you got the jar we sent. Come home soon. Love, Mary. Wilson folded the letter carefully, his throat tight. The jar hadn't lasted. None of it did. Harris was watching him. Bad news. Wilson shook his head. Just my sister. Says they're saving strawberries for me. Harris didn't smile. Didn't make a joke. Just nodded, like he understood exactly what that meant. Somewhere to the east, artillery rumbled. The war wasn't waiting. Wilson pocketed the letter and forced down the last of his rations. The taste of home would have to wait. June 8th, 1944, 1900 hours. The sunset bled crimson across the Normandy sky as Wilson dug another inch deeper into the hard earth. His blistered hands ached around the entrenching tool's wooden handle, each thrust sending jolts of pain up his arms. The new foxhole smelled of damp soil and the faint metallic tang of buried shrapnel. Deep enough yet? Jenkins asked, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. The kid's face was sunburned beneath the dirt, his lower lip cracked and bleeding. Wilson leaned against the cool earth wall, catching his breath. Another foot. Unless you want to wake up with a German bayonet in your ribs. A shadow fell across the hole. Harris stood above them, his injured arm now properly bandaged but still stiff at his side. Mail call's coming, he said, tossing down a canteen. And guess what? We got a real treat tonight. Wilson caught the canteen, the water inside sloshing with an unfamiliar viscosity. He unscrewed the cap cautiously. The scent hit him first, sweet, fruity, with an alcoholic punch that made his eyes water. Where the hell? Medic's stash, Harris grinned. Traded 3 of your precious peppermints for it. Some kind of French brandy he lifted off a dead officer. Jenkins' eyes widened. We're gonna get court-martialed. Only if we live long enough, Harris said, lowering himself gingerly into the hole. Now pass that around before I change my mind. The brandy burned like liquid fire, but after the third swallow, Wilson found he didn't mind so much. A warm glow spread through his chest, easing the constant ache in his muscles. Even Jenkins stopped worrying after his second gulp, a faint flush creeping into his pale cheeks. As twilight deepened, the sounds of the front seemed to retreat. The distant artillery reduced to faint thumps, the sporadic small arms fire fading into the background like crickets on a summer night back home. Harris pulled out a battered harmonica. Any requests? Something that doesn't sound like a dying cow, Wilson muttered, earning a kick from Jenkins. The first notes were hesitant, then settled into a slow, mournful rendition of Stardust. Wilson leaned back against the dirt wall, letting the music wash over him. The brandy buzz softened the edges of the war just for tonight. Above them, The first stars began to appear through the smoke-hazed sky. Jenkins hummed along quietly, his young voice surprisingly sweet in the gathering dark. Harris played with his eyes closed, his injured arm resting across his knees. The harmonica's plaintive wail seemed to carry all their unspoken thoughts, of home, of girls left behind, of lives interrupted. Wilson reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the last peppermint. He hesitated, then placed it carefully on the dirt between them, a silent toast to whatever tomorrow might bring. The music played on as night fell completely, wrapping their little hole in fragile peace. For these few stolen hours, they weren't soldiers. They were just boys under the same stars that shone over Jersey, over Harris's Chicago tenement, over Jenkins' Indiana farmhouse. The brandy was gone too soon. The war would still be there at dawn. But right now, with Hoagie Carmichael's melody lingering in the cooling air and the peppermint slowly dissolving on his tongue, Wilson could almost pretend. June 9th, 1944, 0400 hours. The pre-dawn chill seeped into Wilson's bones as he stood watch. His breath fogged in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of a dying cigarette. The brandy's warmth had long since faded, leaving behind a dull headache and the metallic aftertaste of too little sleep. Movement in the mist caught his eye. Wilson tensed, his rifle coming up smoothly. Then he recognized the familiar slouch. Harris, making his rounds. Anything. Harris whispered as he dropped into the foxhole beside him. Wilson shook his head. Quiet. Too quiet. Harris snorted softly. Now you've gone and jinxed it. He pulled out the harmonica, turning it over in his hands. The moonlight caught the dents and scratches on its surface, each one a story Wilson would never hear. A rustling in the bushes sent both men reaching for their weapons. Wilson's finger hovered over the trigger as a shadow emerged. Jenkins, clutching something to his chest. Look what I found, the kid whispered triumphantly. He unfolded his jacket to reveal 3 brown eggs, still warm from the nest. There's a chicken coop about 50 yards east. Must have belonged to that farmhouse we passed. Harris's eyes gleamed in the dark. You beautiful, thieving bastard. They built a small fire in a tin can, shielding the flame with their bodies. Jenkins cracked the eggs into a mess kit, the yolks glowing like liquid gold in the firelight. The smell was intoxicating, rich and earthy, nothing like the powdered eggs from their rations. Wilson watched the edges crisp, his mouth watering. When the eggs were done, they divided them carefully, savoring each bite. The yolks burst on Wilson's tongue, creamy and decadent. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed real food until this moment. As dawn painted the sky in streaks of pink and orange, the first artillery shells began to fall in the distance. The spell was broken. Harris stamped out the fire while Jenkins licked the last of the egg from his fingers. Wilson checked his rifle, the familiar weight of comfort in his hands. The egg sat warm in his stomach, a small defiance against the war's relentless grind. Happy birthday to us, Harris muttered, slinging his pack over his shoulder. The company moved out as the sun rose, their shadows stretching long behind them. Wilson touched the empty peppermint tin in his pocket, then let it go. Some gifts were meant to be temporary. The road ahead was long, but for now, they marched on, the taste of stolen eggs still fresh in their mouths. June 9th, 1944, 1,330 hours. The village square smelled of burnt timber and something sweet gone rancid. Wilson's boots crunched on broken glass as he moved past the shell of what had once been a bakery, the skeletal remains of its oven still radiating residual heat. A torn bag of flour had exploded against one wall, leaving ghostly white silhouettes where villagers might have stood when the shells hit. Clear, Harris's call echoed from across the square, followed by the metallic clang of a kicked-in door. Wilson adjusted his grip on the Thompson, his palms slick with sweat. The stillness was worse than gunfire. At least in battle you knew where the enemy was. Here, every shadow could conceal a sniper, every cellar a nest of desperate defenders. A whimper cut through the silence. Wilson froze. The sound came again, high-pitched, unmistakably human. He followed it to a collapsed storefront, where a single shutter swung on broken hinges. Kneeling, he peered into the darkness. Two eyes gleamed back at him from beneath an overturned table. Small, terrified. A child's. Jesus, Wilson breathed. He slung his weapon and reached out a hand. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you. The girl couldn't have been more than 6, her blonde hair matted with plaster dust. She shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. A dark stain spread across the front of her dress. Not blood, Wilson realized, chocolate. Melted and re-solidified in uneven streaks. He remembered the peppermint tin in his pocket. Empty now, but maybe. His fingers found one last fragment clinging to the corners. He held it out, the tiny white sliver glowing in the dim light. The girl's eyes flicked between the candy and Wilson's face. Slowly, so slowly, she reached out and plucked it from his fingers. The peppermint disappeared into her mouth with the swiftness of a starving animal. Wilson heard boots behind him. Harris rounded the corner, rifle at the ready. His gaze took in the scene. The child, the chocolate-stained dress, Wilson kneeling in the rubble. Christ, Harris muttered. Then, louder, Jenkins, get Barkley over here. We got a civilian. The girl began to cry, silent tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Wilson didn't know what to do. He'd been trained to clear buildings, to fire and maneuver, not to comfort traumatized children. Carefully, he shrugged off his pack and pulled out his last K-ration. The chocolate bar inside was hard as a brick, but it was something. He broke off a square and offered it. The girl hesitated, then snatched the chocolate and bolted, darting past Harris with unexpected speed, disappearing into the maze of broken walls and shattered lives. Wilson stared at the empty space where she'd been. His fingers closed around the remaining chocolate, the foil wrapper crinkling in his grip. It wasn't much, but maybe, for one moment, it had helped. Move out, Barkley called from the square. We're burning daylight. Wilson stood, brushing plaster dust from his knees. The war wasn't done with them yet. But as he stepped back into the sunlight, he thought of those 2 white tracks on the girl's face, the paths her tears had carved through the dirt. However this ended, they'd all be marked by it. Some stains never came out. June 10th, 1944, 0800 hours. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like damp gauze as Wilson picked his way through the abandoned German trench. The enemy had retreated in the night, leaving behind a treasure trove of discarded equipment. His boot kicked an empty sausage tin, the label still legible in the morning light. Knockwurst, Wehrmacht Verpflegung. Harris whistled from further down the trench. Would you look at this? He held up a loaf of dark bread, only slightly stale. Real fucking bread, Wilson. Actual goddamn bread. Wilson's mouth watered before he could stop it. He reached for his canteen to wash away the sudden rush of saliva. The water tasted of metal and mud, but it grounded him. Jenkins appeared over the parapet, his arms full of tins. They left their whole damn pantry behind. He dropped his haul with a clatter, more sausage, a jar of pickled cabbage, even a tin of real coffee. Merry Christmas, boys. They built a small fire in an empty ammunition box, the flames licking at the morning chill. Harris sawed the bread into thick slices with his combat knife, while Jenkins arranged their bounty like some macabre picnic. Wilson took his first bite of German bread and nearly groaned. The crust shattered between his teeth, the dense rye interior chewy and substantial. It tasted like civilization, like Sunday mornings before the war, when his father would come home from the bakery with a loaf still warm from the oven. Harris smeared sausage fat on his portion. I could defect for this, he mumbled around a mouthful. Jenkins laughed, but it died in his throat when his boot knocked over a discarded helmet. The metallic clang echoed through the empty trench. A photo fluttered out, a smiling German family, the father in uniform, 2 blonde children perched on a bench. The edges were singed. No one spoke. The bread turned to ash in Wilson's mouth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last square of American chocolate. It looked pitiful next to the German spread, waxy and pale. He set it carefully beside the family photo, a strange kind of offering. The fire crackled. Somewhere to the east, a machine gun stuttered to life. Time to move, Harris said, brushing crumbs from his lap. But he paused to tuck the remaining sausage into his pack before climbing out of the trench. Wilson took one last look at the abandoned German position, at the breadcrumbs and the family photo and his melting chocolate. Then he followed his friends toward the next fight, his stomach fuller than it had been in weeks, his heart heavier than it had ever been. June 11th, 1944, 0300 hours. The mortar barrage came without warning. Wilson was jolted awake by the first explosion, his body moving before his mind caught up. Rolling into the lowest part of the foxhole, helmet pulled tight over his ears. Dirt rained down as the next round impacted 20 yards to their left. Jesus Christ. Jenkins scrambled for his rifle, knocking over the empty coffee tin they'd been using as an ashtray. Are we under attack? Harris was already up, peering over the parapet with binoculars. Not us. They're walking it toward the 101 ST's position. Even as he spoke, the explosions marched steadily eastward, each impact sending tremors through the ground. Wilson's hands shook as he checked his watch. 3:17 a.m. The luminous dial cast an eerie glow on his dirt-caked fingers. He wondered if the Germans had watches like this. If some poor bastard in a foxhole across the field was staring at the same green numbers, thinking the same thoughts. The shelling stopped as abruptly as it began. The sudden silence was deafening. Wilson's ears rang with it, the high-pitched whine drowning out the tentative chirp of crickets restarting their night song. Think they're done, Jenkins whispered, as if volume might trigger another barrage. Harris lowered his binoculars. For now. He rubbed at his injured arm, the bandage gray with dirt and sweat. Get some sleep. We move at first light. Sleep was impossible. Wilson lay on his back, staring at the stars between drifting smoke. The constellations were the same ones he'd traced from his bedroom window in Jersey, but they felt different here, colder, more distant, like they'd turned their backs on Europe. A rustling to his left. Harris sat down heavily, pulling out his harmonica. He didn't play, just turned it over in his hands, the moonlight catching the dents and scratches. You ever think about dying? Harris asked suddenly. Wilson considered lying. Every damn day. Harris nodded, running a thumb over the harmonica's reed plate. My old man got gassed in the last war. Came home coughing up pieces of his lungs. He held up the instrument. This was his. Only thing of his I took when I enlisted. Wilson had never heard this before. He waited, letting the night settle around them. Funny thing is, Harris continued softly, I don't even know if he'd be proud or pissed that I ended up here. He blew a single, mournful note. Probably both. The note hung in the air between them, a fragile thing. Wilson thought of his own father's pocket watch, tucked away in his duffel bag in England. The inscription inside, to my son, may you never need to count the hours. Another explosion rumbled in the distance, too far to worry about, close enough to remind them. Harris slid the harmonica back into his pocket. Get some sleep, birthday boy. Tomorrow's gonna suck. Wilson closed his eyes. The stars kept watch. June 12th, 1944, 1,600 hours. The church steeple had taken a direct hit, its cross now hanging at a drunken angle against the evening sky. Wilson picked his way through the rubble, his boots crunching over shattered stained glass that glittered like fallen stars. The scent of incense still lingered beneath the sharper smells of cordite and burnt wood. Harris kicked aside a broken pew. Think the padre left any wine behind. Jenkins crouched by the altar, his rifle balanced across his knees. Sacrilege, Harris. War is sacrilege, kid. Harris nudged a toppled candlestick with his boot. Might as well enjoy the perks. Wilson moved toward the confessional booth, its carved wood miraculously intact. The velvet curtain was torn, revealing a small stash inside. A half-empty bottle of sacramental wine, a moldering hymnal, and a single, dust-covered chocolate bar wrapped in gold foil. He picked it up carefully. Belgian, by the look of it. Probably hidden before the Germans came through. The chocolate had bloomed white with age, but when he snapped it in half, the inside was still dark and rich. Harris whistled. Now that's what I call divine intervention. They sat in the ruins of the sanctuary, passing the bottle and breaking the chocolate into equal shares. The wine was sweet and heavy, the chocolate so intense it made Wilson's jaw ache. Jenkins licked his fingers. Do you think? A single gunshot cracked outside. All three men froze, hands going to their rifles. The bottle tipped over, spilling wine like blood across the broken tiles. Barkley's voice cut through the silence. "On your feet. We've got movement east," Harris cursed, shoving the last of the chocolate into his mouth. Wilson grabbed his helmet, the taste of cocoa and communion wine still on his tongue as he followed his squad into the dying light. The war gave no reprieves, not even in God's house. June 13th, 1944, 0900 hours. The farmhouse kitchen still smelled of fresh bread when they entered. The oven was cold, but a half-eaten loaf sat on the table beside an overturned coffee cup. The family had left in a hurry, coats missing from the hooks, a child's shoe abandoned by the door. Wilson ran a finger through the flour, dusting the countertop. It could have been his mother's kitchen back in Jersey. The same copper pots hanging from the rack, the same faded gingham curtains fluttering at the window. Even the smell was the same, yeast and wood smoke and the faint tang of preserved lemons. Harris whistled as he rifled through the pantry. "Look at this." He held up a jar of honey, golden and thick in the morning light. Real goddamn honey. Jenkins peered into the icebox. "Butter too. And eggs." He hesitated. "We shouldn't. The hell we shouldn't." Harris grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove. "If I'm gonna die today, it's gonna be with real food in my belly." Wilson said nothing. He opened the cupboard and found a tin of tea, Earl Grey, the label still crisp. His mother's favorite. His fingers shook as he set it on the counter. They cooked in silence. Harris fried eggs and butter, the yolks shimmering like liquid sun. Jenkins toasted thick slices of bread over the stove's embers. Wilson brewed the tea in a porcelain pot, the bergamot scent curling through the room like a ghost. They ate standing up, plates balanced on their palms, as if sitting might make this moment too real. The eggs were rich, the bread's crust crackling between their teeth. Wilson's tea was perfect, steeped exactly 3 minutes, just how his mother liked it. A shell landed somewhere in the distance, rattling the cups on their hooks. None of them flinched. Harris licked butter from his thumb. "Best damn meal I ever had." Wilson stared into his teacup, watching the leaves settle at the bottom. Somewhere, this family was hiding in a cellar or fleeing down a country road. Somewhere, his own mother was probably sitting at her kitchen table, sipping the same tea, wondering if her son would ever come home. The radio crackled to life in the other room. Barkley's voice, sharp with urgency. "Move out. Now." Wilson set his cup in the sink. It clinked against the abandoned coffee mug, two lives colliding for an instant before parting ways forever. June 14th, 1944, 0400 hours. The river crossing was supposed to be simple. Intel said the Germans had pulled back. Intel was wrong. Machine gun fire ripped through the pre-dawn fog as Wilson's boots hit the icy water. The world narrowed to the weight of his gear, the numbing cold creeping up his thighs, and the tracers cutting red lines through the dark. Someone screamed to his left. The sound cut off abruptly. "Keep moving." Barkley's voice cut through the chaos. "Push across." Wilson's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning as he fought the current. The water reached his waist now, each step a battle against the sucking mud below. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he felt its passage in the air. Harris was ahead of him, his injured arm making his strokes lopsided. Jenkins lagged behind, the kid's face pale with terror as the water rose to his chest. Then Jenkins disappeared. One moment he was there, the next, only his helmet bobbed on the churning surface. Wilson turned against the current, his arm slicing through the frigid water. He grabbed for the helmet, his fingers brushing the strap before it slipped away. Something solid bumped against his leg. Wilson dove, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. His hands found fabric, a sleeve, a shoulder. He hauled upward with all his strength. Jenkins broke the surface, coughing up river water and bile. His eyes were wild, his fingers clawing at Wilson's jacket like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "Easy. I got you." Wilson tightened his grip, but the current fought him. Their combined gear threatened to drag them both under. Then Harris was there, his good arm hooking under Jenkins' other shoulder. Together, they half-dragged, half-swam the last 20 yards to the far bank, collapsing in the reeds as bullets chewed the foliage above them. Jenkins vomited river water, his whole body shaking. Harris slumped against a tree, his bandage soaked through with blood and water. Wilson lay on his back, staring at the sky as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. The taste of the farmhouse tea was long gone. In its place, the iron tang of blood where he'd bitten his tongue, the sour fear sweat soaked into his uniform, and beneath it all, the ever-present stench of wet wool and gunpowder. Barkley appeared over them, his silhouette black against the lightning sky. "On your feet. We're not done yet." Wilson spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva. Somewhere downstream, Jenkins' helmet spun lazily in an eddy before disappearing around the bend. The river didn't care about their war. It just kept flowing. June 15th, 1944, 2100 hours. The barn smelled of hay and dried blood. Outside, the artillery duel continued, a distant, rhythmic pounding like some monstrous heartbeat. Inside, the wounded lay in rows, their groans blending with the rustle of straw and the occasional skitter of rats in the shadows. Wilson sat with his back against a feed trough, cleaning his rifle by the dim light of a kerosene lantern. The metal was warm in his hands, the familiar motion soothing. Next to him, Harris snored lightly, his injured arm now properly bandaged but still stiff. Jenkins was out cold too, curled up like a child beneath a threadbare horse blanket. A rustle at the door. Wilson's hand went to his sidearm before he recognized the silhouette, Barkley, his face haggard in the flickering light. "Got something for you." The sergeant tossed him a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Wilson caught it, the weight surprising him. He peeled back the layers to reveal a bar of chocolate, not the waxy government-issue stuff, but real Swiss chocolate, the wrapper still crisp. "Where the hell, Red Cross parcel came through. Figured you boys earned first pick." Barkley lit a cigarette, the flare of the match deepening the lines on his face. "Eat it quick before Harris wakes up." Wilson broke off a square. The chocolate melted on his tongue, rich and velvety, with a hint of hazelnut that made his eyes sting. It tasted like before, like Christmas mornings and birthday cakes in his mother's kitchen on rainy afternoons. He looked at Harris, at Jenkins, at the wounded men lying silent in the straw. Then he carefully rewrapped the chocolate and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. Some things were too precious to eat alone. June 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. The first mortar round hit the barn at dawn. Wilson was jolted awake by the concussion, splinters of wood raining down as the east wall disintegrated in a shower of sparks and flame. Someone screamed, a high, animal sound that cut through the ringing in his ears. "Move, move." Barkley's voice cut through the chaos as another round impacted, this time closer. The kerosene lantern toppled, flames licking hungrily at the dry hay. Wilson grabbed his rifle and pack, his fingers closing instinctively around the chocolate in his breast pocket. Harris was already up, hauling Jenkins to his feet as the kid blinked sleep from his eyes. Around them, medics scrambled to evacuate the wounded, their shouts lost in the roar of the fire. They burst into the open just as the third round hit. The concussion knocked Wilson off his feet, his vision widening out for a second. When it cleared, the barn was fully engulfed, flames clawing at the morning sky. Jenkins coughed beside him, his face streaked with soot. The wounded. Barkley's face was stone. Gone. Wilson's hand went to his pocket. The chocolate was still there, slightly softened by his body heat. He thought of the men inside, the ones who wouldn't make it home, the ones who would never taste chocolate again. The Germans had known. They'd known exactly where to hit. Harris spat blood, his teeth red in the dawn light. "Let's return the favor." June 17th, 1944, 1430 hours. The chocolate had melted. Wilson sat in the ruined cellar of a farmhouse, his back against the cool stone wall. The fighting had moved east, leaving behind this temporary pocket of quiet. He pulled the chocolate from his pocket. The oilcloth was sticky now, the once precise squares fused into a single, misshapen mass. Harris sat across from him, methodically cleaning his rifle. His injured arm moved stiffly, but he didn't complain. Jenkins was outside on watch, his silhouette framed in the cellar doorway against the afternoon sun. Wilson peeled back the oilcloth. The scent was still rich, dark cocoa and hazelnut, undercut now by the acrid tang of gunpowder that had seeped into everything. He broke off a piece and held it out to Harris. His friend hesitated, then took it. The chocolate was soft, nearly liquid in the summer heat. It coated his fingers as he lifted it to his mouth. Jenkins turned from the doorway. "You two sharing without me?" Wilson broke off another piece. "Get over here before it's all gone." They ate in silence, the chocolate more a sensation than a taste, warm and rich and fleeting. Outside, the war waited. But for now, in this ruined cellar, they let themselves savor this small, stolen moment. The wrapper was empty now. Wilson folded it carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. It was enough. June 18th, 1944, 0800 hours. The melted chocolate stain on Wilson's uniform had hardened into a dark, glossy patch. He picked at it absently as the truck bounced along the ruined country road, carrying them toward the next objective. Around him, the men sat in exhausted silence, Harris dozing against his pack, Jenkins staring blankly at his boots. The chocolate was gone. The wrapper, too, lost somewhere during yesterday's push through the orchard. Wilson's fingers kept going to that empty pocket, searching for what was no longer there. The truck hit a crater, jolting them all. Harris woke with a curse, rubbing his injured arm. Jenkins blinked, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Next town's ours," Harris muttered, peering over the side. "If the dam bridge is still standing." Wilson followed his gaze. The river ahead was swollen from last night's rain, the water brown and churning. The stone bridge arched across it, intact for now. Jenkins shifted nervously. "You think?" The first artillery shell hit the bridge's midpoint. The explosion sent stone and steel twisting into the sky. The truck swerved violently as the driver slammed the brakes. Wilson's head cracked against the side panel. His vision swam, but through the ringing in his ears, he heard Harris laughing, a raw, broken sound. "Happy fucking birthday to us." June 19th, 1944, 0300 hours. The forest smelled of damp earth and pine resin. Wilson crouched behind a fallen oak, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn chill. The chocolate wrapper he'd found yesterday, crumpled and trampled into the mud near an abandoned German position, was now folded neatly in his breast pocket. It wasn't his. The brand was different, some German confectionery he didn't recognize. But he'd picked it up anyway, smoothing out the creases before tucking it away. Harris shifted beside him, his injured arm stiff in the cold. "See anything?" Wilson shook his head. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant drip of condensation from the branches overhead. A twig snapped. Both men froze. Wilson's finger hovered over his trigger as shadows moved between the trees. Then, "Comrade." The voice was young, trembling. A German soldier stumbled into the clearing, his hands raised. He couldn't have been more than 18, his uniform hanging loose on his thin frame. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage on his thigh. Harris kept his rifle trained. "Well, what do we do with him?" The boy's eyes locked on Wilson's. Blue, terrified. His lips were cracked, his cheeks hollow with hunger. Wilson reached into his pocket and pulled out the German chocolate wrapper. He held it up slowly. The boy's breath hitched. Recognition flickered in his gaze. Then, hesitantly, he reached into his own pocket and produced an identical wrapper, crumpled and stained, but unmistakably the same. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Harris lowered his rifle. Christ almighty. June 20th, 1944, 1100 hours. The prisoner sat with his back against a tree, his wounded leg stretched out before him. The American medic had done what he could, cleaned the injury, wrapped it in fresh bandages, but the boy's face was still pale with pain. Wilson handed him a canteen. The German drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. "Danke," he murmured, his accent thick. Harris watched from a few feet away, his rifle across his knees. "Ask him his name." Wilson hesitated. He'd picked up bits of German from the interrogation sessions, but not enough for conversation. Instead, he pointed to himself. "Wilson." The boy blinked, then nodded. "Klaus." A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, sending dappled sunlight dancing across the forest floor. Somewhere beyond the trees, the war continued. Artillery rumbled like distant thunder, the occasional burst of small arms fire cracking through the stillness. But here, in this small clearing, there was only the sound of Klaus's labored breathing and the occasional rustle of Harris shifting his weight. Wilson reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of his K-ration crackers. They were stale, crumbling at the edges, but Klaus accepted them with trembling fingers. Harris sighed and tossed over his own ration bar. "Happy fucking Christmas." Klaus caught it, his eyes widening at the unexpected generosity. He broke the bar in half and offered a piece back to Harris. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Harris snorted and took it. The three of them sat in silence, chewing their meager meal as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The chocolate wrappers lay between them, side by side in the dirt, one American, one German, both equally empty. June 21st, 1944, 1,600 hours. The medevac truck kicked up dust as it carried Klaus away. Wilson watched it go, the red cross on its canvas roof fading into the haze of the summer afternoon. The German boy had clasped his hand before leaving, a brief, wordless script that said more than any translation could. Harris lit a cigarette, squinting against the sun. Hope the poor bastard makes it. Jenkins kicked at a rock. You think they'll treat him okay? Wilson didn't answer. He touched the German chocolate wrapper in his pocket, now folded neatly beside his mother's last letter. The war would go on. The bridges would keep blowing up, the rations would keep tasting like despair, and men would keep dying in fields and forests just like this one. But for now, the sun was warm on his face, and somewhere up the road, a boy named Klaus was getting a second chance. That had to count for something. June 22nd, 1944, 0400 hours. The mortar barrage started just before dawn. Wilson was already awake, sitting with his back against a crumbling stone wall, sharpening his bayonet by the dim glow of a dying cigarette. The first explosion lit up the eastern skyline, painting the ruins of the village in stark orange relief. Harris jerked upright from where he'd been dozing, his good hand already reaching for his rifle. Shit, they found us. The shells walked closer, each impact sending tremors through the ground. Wilson stuffed the whetstone in his pocket and grabbed his helmet. Across the square, Jenkins scrambled to his feet, his face pale in the flickering light. Move. Barclay's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back to the orchard. They ran through the shattered streets, dodging falling debris as the world erupted around them. A chunk of masonry grazed Wilson's shoulder, sending a hot lance of pain down his arm. He stumbled but kept moving, Harris at his side, Jenkins just ahead. The orchard gate loomed in the pre-dawn gloom, twisted metal hanging from broken hinges. Wilson vaulted through, his boots sinking into soft earth as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the bullet-riddled trees. Then the world went white. The concussion threw him face first into the dirt. His ears rang, his mouth full of the taste of copper and burnt sugar. He rolled onto his back, blinking up at the sky through the branches. Something warm trickled down his temple. Harris appeared above him, his lips moving but no sound coming out. He hauled Wilson up with his good arm, dragging him deeper into the orchard as another shell hit where Wilson had just been lying. Jenkins was already there, his hands shaking as he checked Wilson for wounds. His voice came through the ringing in Wilson's ears like he was underwater. Got a cut? Not deep. Can you hear me? Wilson spat blood and dirt. His fingers found the German chocolate wrapper still in his pocket, the edges now cinched. He nodded, gripping Harris's shoulder for balance as the world slowly came back into focus. The shelling stopped as abruptly as it began. In the sudden silence, birds began to sing stupid, fearless creatures carrying on as if the world wasn't ending around them. Harris wiped the blood from Wilson's forehead with a grimy sleeve. "Happy fucking birthday to us," he muttered, but there was no humor in it this time. Wilson looked back at the burning village, at the crater where he'd nearly died. Then he turned toward the rising sun, toward whatever fresh hell waited beyond the orchard. The wrapper stayed in his pocket. The war waited for no one. June 23rd, 1944, 1,430 hours. The church bells were ringing when they entered the next village. Wilson blinked up at the stone steeple, intact against the summer sky. The sound was surreal after weeks of artillery, clear, resonant tones that seemed to cleanse the air of gunpowder. "Would you look at that?" Harris muttered, his injured arm cradled against his chest. Bells still work. The town square was eerily untouched. Flower boxes bloomed red and white beneath shuttered windows. A bicycle leaned against a fountain where pigeons drank, undisturbed by their arrival. Jenkins adjusted his helmet, eyes wary. This feels wrong. Wilson's fingers brushed the singed wrapper in his pocket as they approached the church. The heavy oak door creaked open before they could knock. An old priest stood framed in the doorway, his cassock worn thin at the elbows. His eyes, pale blue like the German boys, took in their weapons, their dirt-stained uniforms. Then he smiled. "Come," he said in heavily accented English. "Eat." The rectory kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh bread. The priest moved slowly, his hands trembling as he set out bowls of thick vegetable soup, a loaf still warm from the oven, a wedge of yellow cheese sweating in the afternoon heat. Wilson stared at the spread, his stomach clenching painfully. It had been so long since he'd seen real food. The priest poured wine into chipped glasses. "For you," he said, pushing a bowl toward Jenkins. "For all." They ate in silence, the soup rich with herbs, the bread's crust crackling between their teeth. Wilson watched the old man's hands, veined and spotted with age, as they broke another loaf. These hands had never held a rifle, had never killed. Harris wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Why?" The priest refilled his glass. The wine was dark as blood in the sunlight. "Because you were hungry." Outside, the bells tolled 3 o'clock. Somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, the war waited. But here, in this quiet kitchen, there was only the sound of spoons scraping bowls and the old man's soft humming as he cut more bread. Wilson touched the wrapper in his pocket. The edges softened now, the creases worn smooth. He thought of Klaus, of the chocolate they'd never shared. Then he reached for another slice of bread. June 24th, 1944, 0800 hours. The chocolate wrapper was gone. Wilson patted his pockets as the truck rumbled toward the front, his fingers searching for the familiar crinkle of paper. It must have fallen out during last night's shelling, or maybe in the rectory kitchen when he'd reached for that last piece of bread. Harris noticed his fumbling. Lost something? Wilson stared out at the passing fields, the early morning sun painting the grass gold. Nothing important. The truck hit a pothole, jolting them all. Jenkins groaned, rubbing his bruised ribs. "Where are we headed?" "East," Barkley said without looking up from his map. "Intel says the Germans are pulling back." Wilson leaned against the side panel, the metal warm against his back. The wrapper was just paper. The chocolate had been eaten weeks ago. The German boy was probably in some POW camp by now. None of it mattered. The truck rolled past a shelled-out farmhouse, its skeleton black against the sky. A child's toy wagon lay overturned in the drive, one wheel spinning lazily in the breeze. Harris lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke through his nose. "Happy fucking birthday to us." June 25th, 1944, 1930 hours. The sunset bled across the German trenches like an open wound. Wilson crouched in a shell crater, his rifle slick with sweat in his hands. The enemy position was just beyond the next hedgerow, abandoned, if the intel was right. "Move up," Barkley whispered, his face streaked with dirt. They advanced in staggered bursts, from crater to crater, their boots sinking into the churned earth. The German trench, when they reached it, was empty save for the detritus of war, discarded helmets, a broken rifle, a single leather boot standing upright as if its owner had simply stepped out of it. Harris kicked over a ration tin. Gone. Just like they said. Wilson scanned the trench, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Something glinted in the fading light, a small metal tin half buried in the dirt. He pried it loose with his bayonet. Chocolate. The label was faded, but the image was clear, a Bavarian village scene, all rolling hills and timbered houses. The tin was empty save for a few crumbs that smelled faintly of almonds and cocoa. Jenkins peered over his shoulder. "Think it's poisoned?" Wilson shook his head, running his thumb over the pastoral scene. Some German soldier had carried this from home, had opened it in some quiet moment, had savored the last crumbs before moving on, just like Wilson had with his own chocolate weeks ago. Harris sighed. War's hell. Wilson pocketed the tin. It wasn't the same as the wrapper he'd lost, but it would do. June 26th, 1944, 0400 hours. The Bavarian chocolate tin grew warm in Wilson's palm as he lay in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, the company waited in silence, rifles ready, breath shallow for the order to advance. Harris shifted beside him, his injured arm stiff in the morning chill. "You ever think about what you'll do when this is over?" Wilson turned the tin over in his fingers. The metal was smooth where the label had worn away. "Sleep. Eat a real meal." He paused. "Maybe visit Bavaria." Harris snorted softly. "Look at you, planning vacations." A flare went up in the distance, casting long shadows across the field. The order came down the line in whispers, "Move out." "Stay low." Wilson tucked the tin back into his pocket and checked his rifle. The chocolate was long gone, the Bavarian village just ink on metal. But for now, it was enough to know that somewhere beyond this war, such places still existed. The first rays of sunlight touched the horizon as they advanced, their shadows stretching long behind them. June 27, 1944, 1,530 hours. The forest clearing smelled of damp earth and crushed ferns. Wilson knelt beside the wounded German, his fingers pressing a field dressing to the man's stomach where the shrapnel had torn through. The soldier couldn't have been older than 20, his face pale beneath the dirt and stubble, his breath coming in short, wet gasps. "Easy," Wilson murmured, though he knew the kid couldn't understand. "Easy." The German's hand fumbled at his belt pouch, coming away with a small, foil-wrapped square. Chocolate. He pressed it into Wilson's palm with trembling fingers, his lips moving silently. Harris crouched beside them, his rifle scanning the trees. "We need to move." Wilson pocketed the chocolate and adjusted the dressing. The fabric was already soaked through. The German's eyes found his, blue, like Klaus's had been, and held. Then the light went out of them. Wilson closed the kid's eyelids with his thumb. The chocolate in his pocket was warm from dying hands. June 28, 1944, 2,000 hours. The dying embers of the campfire cast flickering shadows on Wilson's face as he turned the German's chocolate over in his fingers. The foil wrapper was pristine, untouched by blood or dirt, a small, perfect square of normalcy in the midst of war. Harris sat across from him, cleaning his rifle with methodical strokes. "You gonna eat that or just stare at it all night?" Wilson didn't answer. The weight of the chocolate in his palm felt heavier than it should. Jenkins poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "Maybe you should save it." "For what?" Harris snorted. "The kid's gone. Chocolate won't change that." Wilson's fingers tightened around the candy. He thought of the German boy's blue eyes going dull, the way his hand had gone limp in Wilson's grip. He thought of Klaus, of the priest's kitchen, of all the small moments of humanity they'd salvaged from the wreckage of war. With deliberate care, he unwrapped the chocolate and broke it into 3 pieces. Harris stared at the piece Wilson offered him. "Christ, Wilson." "Eat it," Wilson said quietly. The chocolate was rich and bittersweet on his tongue, the flavor lingering long after the last crumb was gone. The fire burned low, the night stretched on, and for a little while they sat in silence, remembering the dead. The morning sun filtered through the bullet-riddled trees as Wilson stood at the edge of the field. In his pocket, the empty chocolate wrappers, American, German, the priest's breadcrumbs folded neatly inside, rustled with each step. Harris limped up beside him, his injured arm now in a proper sling. "Orders came through. They're shipping me home." Wilson nodded, watching a lark rise from the battered earth, its song piercing the morning stillness. The bird circled once, twice, then flew east toward the rising sun. Jenkins joined them, his young face already older than it should be. "What now?" Wilson reached into his pocket and pulled out the wrappers. One by one, he let them go, the American K-ration fluttering like a leaf, the German tin glinting as it fell into the grass, the priest's breadcrumbs scattering like seeds on the wind. Harris smiled, just slightly. "Happy fucking birthday to us." The lark's song faded into the distance. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the war would go on. But here, in this quiet moment between battles, the field lay empty and waiting. Wilson adjusted his pack and took the first step forward.